To get out of the way and provide context, I'm not a completionist. I spent roughly 17 hours in the remaster and 5 on the original. I've done some side and faction quests and completed the base game, but as of right now, I'm not touching the DLC, although I may cover it later. Kingdoms of Amalur is an action RPG built for 7th generation consoles. It got a remaster and relatively recent re-release. It's got a lot going for it, some really well-known voice actors, a sprawling world, and an acclaimed author made its extensive history. It's a fairly odd game to cover because there's a lot to love and hate here, and all of the hate is because what it did was well done, but held potential to be groundbreaking and truly remarkable. And after playing it, I just have mixed feelings. I understand what fans see in it. It has boundless potential and deserved the remaster it received. But I wish they went further and added in what I personally thought was missing. Maybe if it sells well enough, they'll get a new team to continue what the creators never could. But for now, it's a game equally amazing and awful. Kingdoms of Amalur is an intriguing title with plenty of new ideas, bringing both novelty and unique problems to its marvelous universe. It's focused on the player, sacrificing everything to empower the player, refusing to punish them unless they choose the hardest difficulty. It's supported by a solid audio and visual production, full of color, saturation, scenery to explore, and a plot with an exceptionally charming cast. While the story is nothing special, it's functional and fulfills the player's fantasy, and provides them their spotlight. It's something I'm sure to think about often, but whether I'll have wholly positive or negative takeaways will take time, as there's a lot to unpackage. Kingdoms of Amalur's gameplay is mostly combat, which is great, considering it's kinetic, fast, and has a decent skill ceiling attached to it. There are active and passive abilities, parries, and various weapons and classes to play with. Not to mention the unique systems like the fate cards, which act as a class system, and the reckoning mode to add on a bit more flavor to it. It notably complements the power fantasy design present by enabling the player to be and do anything they desire. And to jump right in, classes are facilitated through fate cards, dependent on where the player distributes their levels in the talent tree. Every time the player levels up, they may slot a point into one of 3 trees to unlock a passive or active ability. The 3 trees are Rogue, Warrior, and Mage. They mimic the standard holy trinity of role-playing games. The classes of Amalur offer unique buffs based on which card is equipped, and these cards are unlocked based on point distribution. Fate cards unlocked by throwing all the player's points into the warrior tree will offer significant buffs for melee playstyles that focus on hitting hard and shrugging off damage, while a fate card using points from the rogue and mage tree will play more like an arcane trickster. And a fate card using all 3 archetypes will function as a universalist and a generalist. They'll emulate the jack-of-all-trades persona with their benefits. Complementing classes and archetypes are weapon types. Investment in the 3 trees can expand and enhance the effectiveness of corresponding weapons. And the majority of weapons are fast and kinetic. The outliers rely on hitting hard and putting their weight behind their punches. There are some exceptional standouts, and all are fine, but not every weapon performs the same in damage, depth, or feel. For example, weapons like greatswords and hammers feel overly similar. Both feature slow, weighty, and large hits. They focus on knocking back, cleaving, and hitting harder rather than faster. The standard sword suffers from being an all-rounder and recognizably generic, as expected, while weapons like the scepters, Feyblades, and chakrams all stand out as unique and powerful contenders. Notably, the chakrams stand above their peers, boasting severe damage, area of effect attacks, fast animations, and multi-hitting combos. And unlike the Feyblades, their inspiration isn't from another game, World of Warcraft. So whether intentional or not, the Feyblades do mimic WoW's Demon Hunters a bit too much for my taste, and they just don't compare to the Chakrams with their novelty and historical inspiration. However, I will say that despite the range present here, even the worst weapon in Amalur feels fun and performs well on all but the most challenging difficulties. I merely wanted to highlight how impressive one weapon managed to shine above all its peers, and how I wish that was the standard and not the exception. But I will continue with another negative. The weapons are great, but lack some variety. There are great swords, hammers, chakrams, Feyblades, scepters, daggers, and staffs. A total of 8 weapons, which generally would be fine, plentiful even, if this wasn't Kingdoms of Amalur. Amalur needs variety to stimulate some of its more repetitive elements, and worse, the Reckoning mode uses many more weapons than what is available in the game, bringing attention to it. 2 notable examples are the Mace and Spear, which I wish were in the game. Their existence hints at the possibility that it was intended for there to be more weapon type, and it regrettably feels necessary to absolve some of the game's faults. So the game highlights a potential for more weapon types and doesn't capitalize on it, creating a weird void where there should be content. But moving on, Reckoning mode is the player's universal special. It builds as the player deals and takes damage, allowing them to slow down time, like bullet time, on activation and deal increased damage. Of special note is the executions. They unlock when enemies are slain during Reckoning mode. They'll enter a prone-like state and offer a button prompt for a brutal execution animation, which is followed by another button prompt that increases experience gain based on the results of the player mashing said button. The feature's cool as hell. I personally love it for its feel, but in design, it struggles to captivate me in the same way. Instead, Reckoning mode creates a unique problem in the game. Basically, due to the experience modifier, players are encouraged to save their meter and expend it on boss fights. This trivializes boss fights and ruins their challenge. I understand I could not use the bar, but the experience curve feels dependent on this application. So, I used it. Furthermore, the incentive is present regardless of whether or not I act on it. I don't think it's the worst implementation ever, nor is it entirely intentional. But I merely thought that it deserved some attention and declaration as it affected my playtime. In fact, I use it to skip grinding, as that was more relevant to me than a challenging boss fight. So, overall, it's a powerful and fun mechanic, regardless of my criticism. Point shifts well into the discussion of difficulty, or lack thereof. I was on normal, and my friend playing at the same time as me was on the hardest difficulty. I watched them play for several hours over multiple days, and got to see the game both on the normal difficulty and the hardest difficulty.
Jacob, if you're listening to this, you lost the game.
My thoughts are that difficulty is overall artificial. On the hardest difficulty, it curves the enemy and scaling exponentially against the player. The result is a grind fest, or mastery of every mechanic available to produce the best odds of winning a fight, under-leveled. It isn't inherently bad. The option for a challenge mode is welcome, but it's not hardcore or really a preferable way to play the game. I'll also say that the default difficulty is a bit too easy. I never had to grind, but it wasn't even artificially easy. I wasn't very far ahead of my opponents. Instead, I had a simple mastery over the movesets, their movesets, and my character's capabilities, to the point where combat was trivial. And this is primarily because there's a lot of fighting in Amalur. It's the core gameplay element, after all. But more than that, it's an issue of broader repetition. About halfway through the game, I ran out of new enemy types, and was greeted only by quote-unquote harder reskins of the previous enemies. While their numbers were inflated, admittedly, I already knew their patterns and could avoid or parry all their moves, so they weren't very difficult. So once some time has passed and mastery is obtained over oneself and their foes, then fights become a battle of attrition. Is your attack high enough? And is your opponent's defense low enough? Can you whittle away at their health before boredom creeps in? So it's seldom difficult on normal. It rarely is atrocious, but it can be like hitting a wall in harder difficulties. Suck it up and swing your pool noodle for way too long, or go grind and come back later. Overall, the game isn't challenging, given the time and attention to master, that is. The biggest drawback, honestly, is a lack of enemy and boss variety. When unique one-time bosses appear, they're cinematic and epic, but they're few and far between throughout the game. Were there more movesets and mechanics to master, then the game may have offered a better action experience. Which is why I opt for more weapon types, because I think it would absolve the issue. But last, and certainly not least, skills are a problem, I think. I don't mind enchanting, lockpicking, or even cooking in my RPG. If anything, I enjoy it. I played several hundred hours of Fantasy Life and Skyrim. The auxiliary systems, in my eyes, are cool and complementary to the fantasy. But in Amalur, many of these systems lack purpose or impact. They primarily exist for shallow role-playing purposes, with a few outliers. Most skills can be ignored in favor of mastery over the associated minigame. Smithing, in particular, feels useless. Perhaps my friend and I had terrible luck, but anytime we crafted new gear, it would be scaled out by a free piece in the next chest we found. Lockpicking and dispelling are conveniences, only allowing for skipping of some minigames. On one hand, I appreciate the accessibility, but the needless waste of points these cost me were frustrating. If you're used to those games, stealth skill can be ignored with patience and memorization. Overall, it just feels like many skills facilitate ease of access for role-playing activities the player isn't naturally good at. Want to be a rogue, but you're not so good with the minigame? Level your skills to get around it and retain the fantasy. It's a straightforward design intention, but it feels counterintuitive. The lack of meaningful opportunity cost removes the value of skill. Even if it doesn't punish the player, it punishes the experience. And all of this is to say that there are some skills that feel useless, and counterintuitively, there are some skills that have value. Persuasion, for example, has active and limited benefits only available to it. I can't find a way to skip this fight in a chest, but I can click this option and use my skills to increase my chances. It's just aggravating to see inconsistency of value in skills. On the one hand, it is punishing to not take certain skills, and on the other, they're just flavor points. Little things like the ability to just find more money every time you loot, the ability to craft potions that don't get replaced by higher grade potions so their value isn't diminished. It's just such a nitpick, but it obviously frustrated me. Contrasting skills, however, are abilities, whose passive effects even have a visual representation, sometimes altering the entirety of gameplay. For example, weapon skills add new combos, moves, and options to the associated weapons. They provide an upgrade to a widely used and limited system beyond a spreadsheet change. It's pretty cool, actually. Furthermore, many active and passive combat skills serve player fantasy and empowerment, occasionally offering new ways to mechanically maneuver combat. There are skills such as grappling hooks, skeleton summons, chain lightning, and even alterations to combo chains and variations for weapons. Personally, I was able to play a magic knight, capable of sundering the earth with strength or intellect, and it was badass. I could throw lightning as easily as my grappling hook. I had synergy in my weapons, using chakrams for range, and an assortment of melee weapons for anything that gets a little too close for comfort. Also, last tidbit, the camera, and targeting at least on the controller, can make the game much harder due to its feeling stiff, clipping into the ground, and just not working as well as expected. It's actually disappointing, considering the original Amalur didn't have as much ground clipping as the current one's camera does. It's nothing major, but another annoyance that might scare off some players who consider it a pet peeve. But ultimately, I feel like the gameplay fulfilled its purpose. I could feel powerful. I could have multiple flavorful and visually pleasing spells. But I began to tire as the game continued. Reskins of enemies without mechanical changes worsen the issue. As the game continues, the novelty of weapons and enemies wear, and it feels like the old dog has run out of new tricks. It just gets ridiculously repetitive, and it's a shame because with more enemies, it wouldn't wear and tear as much, and it's fun when it's not repetitive. Also, tangent, investing in any crafting skill is hugely frustrating as they offer no benefit compared to what is provided via chest. Explore, quest, whatever, and you will naturally progress, which is honestly fun and awesome. It's designed so that not investing isn't punishing, making the skill system feel like it's only for looks, at least for crafting skills. It's not terrible. If anything, it's intentional and holds true to the designer's goals. And chests are valuable, which makes exploration and questing fun. And that's all to say that overall, it's a bit streamlined, awkward at times, but purposeful, and succeeds at fulfilling the player fantasy. Kingdoms of Amalur establishes itself as generic fantasy throughout its design. High fantasy in its color scheme, story, and world, dark in its music, some monster choices, and the grim themes it occasionally sneaks in. Overall, it has moments of creativity that demand appreciation, and at other times, it's dominated by standards and the odd idea that clashes considerably with typical tropes it includes. There's plenty to see and hear in Amalur, and the breadth of its history is worth investing in, even if it has its oddities. The most obvious example of the world's habits would be the races. There are humans, fays, and gnomes. Humans and fae boast variants, but the human ones aren't as highlighted enough to warrant anything beyond some flavor. On the other hand, the fae represent seasonal and fantasy elements representing the natural order and have variants based on the seasons they're from. I actually really like the fae in this game. And then there's the gnomes, which, well, they're odd, but more on that later. Humans are the least complex of the races, offering several variants, but rarely addressing them. The humans hint at cultural and regional variants, but aside from their minor stat buffs when choosing their race, and a few main characters bringing up cultural history occasionally, they're just depicted as the white bread race of the game. You cannot go wrong with putting good old humans in your setting, especially with the role-playing aspects implemented in the game. It's comfortable, it works, it's fine, it's just not very creative. And the parts that were creative weren't highlighted enough. But moving on, the Fae are fascinating. They mirror fairies and Fae and elves in other fantasy settings. The Fae are compelling in their dependence of fate, and they take comfort in the expected and live their endless lives in careful repetition. It's really compelling, actually. It's interesting in contrast to considering fate and destiny as evil. The comfort of not making those choices, of no unknown, is a compelling concept. It's realistic in a sense that many prefer tradition and want what always was to always be. It's what they know, and that makes sense. Don't get me wrong, I'm on the side of personal autonomy and free will, but the dialogue here is preferable to the monologue in most games. Most games focus on fate and destiny as an evil thing that everyone wants to get rid of except the bad guys. But the Fae are mostly neutral here, even your friends, and occasionally your enemies. But they want fate to survive because it's all they've ever known, which is interesting, honestly. So I find their purpose and place in the world valuable. They add much needed depth to the narrative's kind of shallow themes. And furthermore, the seasonal variants highlight different aspects of fate and life in general. The Summer Phase House of Ballads is cyclical and highlights the importance of stories, ballads if you will. But the Winter Fae House of the Dead focuses on the significance of death. Immortals discuss the importance of death and decay, an incredibly ironic and persuasive piece of the world. How things have to die so that new things may be born, in, an environment in nature. It's awesome. But then there are the gnomes. There's a little novelty with the gnomes, which I feel are a bit misplaced. Maybe I'm prejudiced against little folk, which is odd, being that I am one, but they just feel out of place. Gnomes and little people, aside from dwarves, are an established archetype. A stereotype that they're meek, lucky, and whimsical little jokesters. They hold to their novelty by going against the curve, but the overwhelming establishment makes it hard to take the Praetorian gnome guards seriously. They're Roman gnomes. It's wild. It's especially strange when paired with their prideful and stern manners, further contrasting the status quo. In a world with so little standing out, it's apparent that a race that clashes this hard with its roots are, plainly put, hard to swallow. I think that's the best way to describe the gnomes. Continuing, exploration is a crucial piece of Amalur's puzzle. There's tons of content spread across the land, and there's a good bit out there worth finding. The lore stones are a great example. They're standing stones that offer a monologue of history when touched, and give the world a sense of flavor and life. They're scattered throughout each area, and some are off the beaten path, necessary for progression, and feel well woven in the world. They bring up history, legends, myths, and occasionally illuminate major characters' thoughts. I enjoyed finding them and would always make my way over whenever I spotted one. However, for all that there is to do and all that there is worth doing, there is one antagonist to exploration. Walking. You are fated to walk. A lot. Even when you break fate, you're still fated to walk. A lot. There's no sprinting, there's no mount, there's no horses, and I think the fast travel points are too spread out to alleviate the issue. Combined with fetch quest and the amounts of walking necessary just for story quest, it just feels needlessly tedious. Now, the player can roll and hold forward, eventually even spec into a fate card with a teleport dash to overcome all this, but it's still too much and immensely frustrating. It's a waste of your time, and on top of the existing repetitive assets, adds too much needless padding on playtime. It's basically offensive design to the player. But aside from that, I think the world is overall well crafted, not given enough attention with matching intent to do itself justice, which means what is present is consistently worthwhile. It's a world with mystery, and by the end of the game, there are still new mysteries and discoveries waiting or hinted at in the event of a sequel. I was impressed and almost wanted to remove my generic labeling, but creative implementation here and there doesn't mean it's in its entirety new and novel. And to finish up, I'll summarize the plot quickly. I'm not going to discuss spoilers because they're not worth talking about. The story isn't what the focus is here. So, the Fae can't die because they are not fated to die, and a usurping group of Fae are on a genocidal quest to kill the Dustmen, or humans. I think Dustman's technically a slur, actually, so my bad. It's explained more later, but not enough, I'd say. The most decisive moments of the plot boil down to the fantastic side characters and their own personal arcs. It's a shame. The direction of the story has the player leave some characters behind and shift from companion quests to plot-relevant ones. It's not awful, but it prioritizes being epic more than anything else, and I'd say it achieves that handedly. Some of the boss fights in the main story are the most memorable and cinematic moments Amalur has to offer, so I'll admit, style can triumph over substance when done well. All that being said, side quests aren't as consistent. The faction quests are great, but are the outliers here, and their writing can even be significantly stronger than the main plots, while the side quests are consistently underwhelming. To dive a bit deeper, faction quests are exciting. They look into the other races, cultures, and dilemmas. They're well crafted, and second only to the main plot and overall quality, and even then, they sometimes usurp the plot with their strong themes. Mechanically, they're more interesting than the side quest, and feature unique and fun objectives. They have their own cast, sometimes rope in the main story characters, and tell a contained narrative. I enjoyed the two I explored, and the House of Ballads faction quest was the highlight of my whole playthrough. I really recommend exploring them yourself should you pick up Amalur. As for side quests, it's best to note some context. The world is 10 million years of unique history crafted by an award-winning author, and I'd say it's used poorly. Essentially, side quests are uninteresting mechanically, and feel like mindless time sinks, all for potential tidbits of progress and maybe a bit of lore. They're consistently a waste of time, many being fetch quests or similar to them. Outside of the faction quest, there's no real reason to dive into quest for lore. The faction quest offers bits of lore when found, and the main plot is the lens through which I recommend peering into this meticulously crafted world, which, again, I've already praised. It's wonderful. The villains are dastardly and eventual cathartic punching bags, and the close friends you make along the way are very well my favorite part of the game, which makes it a shame whenever they're off screen. See, these companions can join your party for a limited time, and have fantastic banter and dialogue, but are absent for most of the game. Their lack of presence is noticeable anytime they leave the screen because of their impact. If Kingdoms of Amalur was a party RPG, I'm sure it would have only been a much better experience. Instead, they're consistently absent, only appearing for plot events and rarely even participating in them. Much of their impact in the story is off-screen, further contributing to their feeling missing and disconnected from the story. Once I cycle through their various dialogue cues, which are mostly exposition dumps, I've got nothing left to go by. Most of what I learn about my companions is from asking others about them. It feels like a waste, and the potential of an intimate party RPG leaves me wondering what could have been. That being said, the VA is well done, which makes me want to listen to them even more. I recognize some Skyrim voices here and there, but the most recognizable was Cantor's Ordo from KOTOR, playing one of the player's closest allies throughout the game. I also enjoyed Alan Shearer's VA and wish she had stuck around more in the campaign. In conjunction with the solid voice acting was the robust dialogue. These characters had personalities, goals, and wit. It was all wonderfully expressed, and the only downside being an overwhelming amount of exposition present. But to finish off my praise for the characters, I'll say they look stunning. They are a bit revealing, but I like their look regardless. Agarth looks like a hero past his best years, and Aelin fits the concept of an assassin shrouded in mystery. The various gnomes you meet reflect their pride or humility in their outfits well, and I had no complaints with any one of them. I really want to hone in on how sad it made me to see these characters come and go. I wish they were omnipresent, and the story was ours instead of mine alone. Perhaps that's unrealistic in lore and in budget, but I can dream, right? Finally, the themes, or lack thereof. Amalur in the bulk of its writing discusses fate and its cruelty. The endless loop is unsatisfying, and for mortals, it's damning. I'll avoid spoilers, but overall, it's painted as a cruel law of nature. The only exception is the comfort the Faes find in a known future. It's a proper theme for an epic, sundering fate, rebelling against the nature of the world for personal and universal freedom. I don't mind it, but I want to warn you that it's not incredibly deep outside of some side or faction quest. So, there it is. Kingdoms of Amalur is as broad as it is deep, but other times shows off truly novel and compelling moments. The cast and the writing consistently prove their potential and prowess, only bogged down by their extraneous outliers. This is a game with extreme focus and succeeds in their pursuits, at the cost of what I personally value. However, that doesn't subtract from the quality of the game, and the fascination with what could have been. This is a game that, with more resources and development, could have easily been a staple of gaming, something like Witcher 3 or Skyrim. Its scope was simply too demanding for its team. But for those that can suffer through its shortcomings, I'm sure it's their favorite game ever.